Good morning. Thanks for coming out and spending a little bit of time with me this morning. My name is Bill Harrod, and I'm with CA Technologies. CA is one of the largest independent software companies in the world. You may know us as a mainframe software vendor from years and years and years ago, but we also are one of the largest distributed software vendors, and particularly in the area of security. So I'm Bill Harrod. I'm an advisor in our cybersecurity practice, and I cover only public sector. So I cover federal, state, throughout the United States. And this morning, we'll talk a little bit about privileged identities, privileged identity management. This is the session synopsis. Better understand what privileged user management entails, what your agency's exposure is, recent breaches that can be attributed to it, and talk a little bit about what you can do. You know, I work with a number of federal and state agencies, and we talk about privileged identity management. When we talk about it, we're typically talking about how do we manage what our system administrators, our database administrators, our admins, super users, whatever you want to call them, how do we manage what they can do? Because they have additional privileges that a typical user does not. So we begin this discussion, and inevitably, I hear things like, we have a small team of system administrators. They're drug tested, they're background checked, they're highly trained. These are professional people, right? And I agree. All of those things are true. These are the good guys. But we also have Edward Snowden, drug tested, background checked, held a top secret security clearance, was a good guy until he wasn't. Now, this isn't to mean that there aren't lots and lots and lots of system administrators who work for us every day, do exactly what they're supposed to do. The vast majority of them really are good guys. But it only takes one. And it doesn't even have to be a good guy gone bad, right? The system administrator's compromised credential can be used to do all sorts of other things, whether it's inadvertent, whether it's malicious, or whether it's simply that their credential gets compromised. So how does that happen? Has it ever happened? You know, can you say Target or Home Depot or UPS? You know, Target was a big target, right? One of the largest and one of the most notorious. 40 million credit card numbers in 3 weeks. 70 million user records, right? And an estimated $200 million to credit unions and local banks, not the big banks, but local banks, to reissue approximately half of the credit cards that were actually stolen. This was huge. One of the questions yesterday in one of the keynotes was, does it ever affect the stock price, or what happens? It hits Target's stock price, not so much for Home Depot, but Home Depot lasted 6 months. 56 million credit cards and debit cards compromised. And one of the really interesting things about the Home Depot breach is that the information that they took, credit card, debit card, also email addresses. Who uses Home Depot? Do you ever get an electronic email of your receipt? I do, right? They have my email address. The other day, in my email, I got a letter from Home Depot. Yes, we've been compromised, we acknowledge it, we'll sign you up for 6 months of credit monitoring, right? Reactive at best, sort of after the fact, it doesn't help a whole lot. But in addition to that, what they're seeing, and Brian Krebs on security, some of the other people that write about this are saying, is that the banks are seeing that the bad guys that took these credit cards and debit cards are now matching that information with dates of birth, and the last 4 digits of your social security number, and calling up the banks and going through the automated voice recognition process and resetting the PIN number. So you don't have the PIN number, they do, and they can make huge transactions based on the fact that they can reset the PIN number. And then UPS, 51 stores in 24 states, another huge breach. Others that we've talked about or heard about recently. Community health, electronic health records, 206 hospitals in 29 states, right? Attributed to Chinese hackers. Also the Russian cyber crew that stole 5 million more user IDs and passwords. Huge numbers of compromises that are going on. And what we're really seeing is these are just the tip of the iceberg, and these are the ones that get known, right? So much of what happens never gets publicized. So how does it happen? How do these attacks work? The first one, and this has been discussed some earlier, the guy that did the Galactic Empire presentation touched on some of this. Kevin Mandian touched on some of this yesterday, right? So the first thing is to identify a device or a network of devices that's running remote desktop protocol, a remote desktop service, right? In your network, do you have any devices that run remote desktop sign-on, something like LogMeIn or Windows Desktop Service or Windows, Apple Desktop? Anybody? Yeah? If you don't, I'd ask if you're really, really sure. The other thing is it doesn't have to be in your network. It just has to connect to your network, right? Part of what happened with Target was that there was a vendor's software running in the Target network to monitor HVN or to monitor air conditioning. And when it called out to report back the statistics for energy usage and consumption, right, it had default passwords on it. It's one of the things that allowed them in. So once we have a foothold, we know a protocol that we can use to move within the network, right? Then we serve it up via malware or phishing emails, right? And there's been a lot of talk about that in the past day already, right? Something gets served up, it looks like it ought to be useful, somebody clicks on it, they open a PDF document, they open a zip file, they open a Word document, they go to a website. There are lots of ways to get the malware down onto the device. And again, this doesn't have anything to do with our system administrators or privileged users. It could be anybody at this point, right? But once we get it on the network, we can now move around within the network. So step 3, we leverage that remote desktop protocol to find my point of sale systems. Right? Much of what happened with Target and UPS and Home Depot was black POS is one of the things they're calling it. Right? And particularly for Target, their POS systems were running Windows XP, a no longer supported operating system, just by the way. But there are also OS indeterminate versions of this, something called back off, right? That allows you to do the same sort of thing. Go out and scrape the memory. All this stuff is sitting in memory, unencrypted. Gather all of that, package it up, and exfiltrate it out of the network. The other thing is to simply sit someplace and wait for privileged credentials to be used. So a system administrator goes out and logs on to a Unix box, SUs to root, they grab those credentials, right? Or a database administrator. Or maybe they're just dumping memory. Part of the heartbeat attack was that it was just dumping memory, hoping that they'd get lucky and find the credentials there. Or I sit and wait until a script runs, or a cron job, or something that has the embedded credentials in it, and I grab that. So now I have escalated privileges, I have a credential I can use, and I can move around inside the network. Bingo. I own you. So, does anybody have anybody in your organization that ever clicks on something and opens something, even inadvertently, even clicks on it by mistake and says, I wish I hadn't done that, right? This is a picture of my spam folder, my quarantine folder, right? This is all the stuff that gets filtered out, right, so that people don't click on it. But it happens all the time. So I'm going to borrow a little scenario that Jay Leno used to do this, the late night guys do this, right? We're going to play a little game. We're going to call it click or don't click. So, delivery notification from TNT Express. Click or don't click? Don't click. This is a smart group. All right, payment of your overdue fund through ATM card. Not your ATM card, but through ATM card. Click or don't click? Don't click. My picture for you from Virginia. Click or don't click? Well, you're right. Normally I would say don't click, but if you don't, then you'll miss this picture of my daughter and I at her wedding in June. I had to throw that in. All right, so what does this have to do with you? Why do you care? You know, the agencies that you all work for don't have the credit card numbers typically, although we have a few that do a lot of payment card industry stuff. But why is it important for you? The information that you're protecting, that you're responsible for, is citizen data, tax data, employee health information, Social Security information, benefits information. The list goes on and on. It is highly, highly valuable. But it's not likely to show up in one of the dark site commerce places where people are going to be selling it for $1 a record, right? It's going to get captured and used by a nation state. It's going to get captured and used to go out and commit fraud against your benefit system, against federal benefit systems, or against the individual citizens. And once the toothpaste is out of the tube on that, it's going to be really hard to get it back. There isn't spending $200 million to, reissue half of those credit cards, right? You can't unbreak that egg once that personal information for the citizens gets out. And this is a great statistic. 28% of companies who suffered an incident said it was by an insider threat. You know, we talk for a long time, we've talked about insider versus outsider. Where's our greatest risk, right? I would submit to you that the breaches that we talked about, Target, Home Depot, UPS, any of the Targets, any of the, TJX, TJ Maxx, another big one, all of those, right? Were they by insiders? Maybe. Perhaps it was inadvertent. Perhaps there was somebody who got careless or somebody who's got compromised. But it doesn't matter. This insider threat becomes 100% when what we've allowed to happen is somebody has grabbed a credential that's gone across the wire internally and used that to leverage privileges that they shouldn't have had, and then gather all that information and exfiltrate it. So there really are three types of insiders. And I would submit that everything that happens, right, all of our serious breaches that we hear about, the state of South Carolina, all of those had some combination of this going on, right? So we get three types of insiders: the exploited insider, the insider who is malicious, who intends to do harm, somebody who has been a good guy and gone bad, or is disgruntled, or somebody who worked for the agency and now no longer works for the agency, and for whatever reason his credentials have not been appropriately revoked. We tell a story about Jason Cornish, a guy who worked for a drug company in New Jersey who got fired. He was a contractor. He got let go, right? He went into a McDonald's, sat down, opened up his laptop, connected to the drug company's VPN. He had been a system administrator. He still had the ability to go into the virtual servers that the company ran. He shut down the virtual servers, and they weren't able to do email or do billing or fulfill orders for a week. $800,000, right? And he wiped out all of their virtual servers sitting at a McDonald's connected to the McDonald's Wi-Fi, right? So it's just, there are lots of ways that malicious insiders can affect us. But it goes much beyond that, right? So it goes to the exploited insider, right? To people, and one of the things that they said in the presentation about the galactic empire, right? So there's a natural tendency to somebody to say, I need help, will you help me with this, right? The restraining bolt, would you remove the restraining bolt, please, right? It's that same kind of thing, right? I can't get into my VPN, would you reset my password, right? The social engineering aspect, and I really like this, this quote, it's social engineering is the clever manipulation of the natural human tendency to trust and want to help others, especially others who are in some sort of distress, right? We want to help somebody out. They call you, say, you know, can you reset my password? It doesn't have to be somebody you know, right? There's no strong authentication, but it's like, yeah, I'll do what I can to help you out, right? So they get exploited, the social engineering. And then the careless insider. And it doesn't have to be somebody who is clueless. It just has to be somebody who gets enticed enough to click the link and join here. And then we have all the threats, right? And it can come from current employees and former employees and vendors and contractors, and it can be a huge impact to our organization. And the real challenge of the privileged insider is that we combine this all-powerful access, unrestricted root access or super user, often with a lack of segregation of duties. We're forgetting to observe or enforce least privilege, right? And then we have abuse, or intentional or inadvertent use of a trusted credential, a privileged credential. Or the credential is in a service job or a script. And then there's the lack of accountability, right? So we get the finger pointing, right? A lack of a strong audit trail, or somebody's turned off the logs, because if I'm a system administrator, I can often shut the log down, or I can erase the log, right? And we lose the ability to understand who did what, to be able to really see those actions that occurred, and the use of shared accounts, right? So the business value of privileged identity governance is that it addresses the challenge of both of these, all-powerful access and a lack of accountability, by automating the relationship between trusted people, their credential, their access rights across all points in our enterprise, right? Again, if we have a weak point in the enterprise, it doesn't matter how good our controls are on the front door and the back door, they'll find a way around it. So we need to be complete. So privileged identity governance really takes sort of three main topics, right? And the idea is that it brings together these three critical areas so that agencies can remove common exploitation points within their IT environment and prevent insider and external attacks, right? And this is true whether it's somebody on the inside who is malicious or inadvertent or has the lack of audit trail. We can combine all of these together and address them through these 3 points. So, identity and access governance. The ability to leverage the analytics to begin to assess who has what accesses today. What orphaned accounts or ghost accounts still exist in our network, right? We need to be able to get a handle on what accounts are there, what privileges exist, who might have excess privileges that they don't really need. In the federal government, I see lots of people that have been in an organization for 20 years, right? And they've been in a number of different jobs, or they've been on different tasks or different working groups. And every time they get assigned a new role or a new function, or they get assigned temporarily to a different group, they get new entitlements, right? And do you ever go back and take away those entitlements? Very seldom does that ever happen. And why? It's because if you're going to do that, don't call me at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon and say, this system is down, or this application is having a problem, can you help us with it? Well, no, I worked on it 6 months ago and you took away my privilege, so I can't help you. Right? That's the kind of response we get. Right? But as a result, we leave ourselves exposed. We also need to be able to automate the granting and removal of those entitlements and roles. We need to begin to build a role model and move to true role-based access controls and enforce consistent centralized policies across the entire organization to be able to enforce segregation of duties and least privilege, to be able to decompile what people can do. As a system administrator, maybe I'm a Unix administrator, I need to be able to go in and enter commands on the command line for a Unix system. Maybe it's only for certain Unix systems, right? I've got one federal account that has several thousand Unix servers across the entire United States, right? They have a team of Unix administrators. How do they get into that system, right? They putty to that system, and they put in user ID and password for root access. How can you keep track of that many user IDs and passwords? You write them down. They have a notebook with all the Unix administrator passwords in it, right? Not a good way to do this, right? So maybe what I need to do is I separate some of that out. Maybe I can start and stop services on the Unix box, but I can't start and stop the database. That's not my responsibility. Or I can't dump that database to tape. And oh, by the way, take it with me. And maybe I don't need to be able to do the same thing on a Windows box because there's a differentiation between Linux administrators, Unix administrators, and Windows administrators. But typically, those sorts of things get blurred as we move up the organizational chain and nobody ever goes back and looks at it. So we need to be able to provide that segregation of duties, and we need to be able to do it proactively, where we can actually check those segregation of duties before we provision somebody with that access or that account. And to be able to monitor and report on who has access to what, who approved that access, and how is it being used. I need to be able to look at it and say, yep, this is what they ought to be doing, and they're doing the right things. Or maybe I need to be able to go back and say, something happened, somebody formatted a Unix box when it shouldn't have been formatted. Who did it? Well, it went that way. Right? I can actually go out and collect that session, be able to look at it and say, even from a learning perspective, this is what happened, right? It's easy to do RMRF and reformat a Unix box. Lots of people have done it, right? I've done it, right? But we need to be able to know who did it and why. And then we need to be able to leverage fine-grained access controls to be able to give that privilege to the right people so that they can do the right things and be able to control it all the way down to the operating system on the box. To be able to automate access to root or super user so that if I am a system administrator, I'm not using a shared account, right? I can go in and check out that account when I need it, have it log me in, I do what I need to do, I get done, I log the account back in, and it changes the password on that root account. Excuse me. And if I need to be able to access something that I don't typically have access to, I have a break glass capability, right? For exigent circumstances in an emergency, I can go in and say, I am authorized to be able to break this glass. I do it. It gives me the access I need at 3 o'clock in the morning or because somebody's away, whatever it is, In an exigent circumstance, I can do that and claim the account to be able to get access to the system, do what I need to do, but understand when you break the glass, it sets off an alarm. Somebody's going to know, somebody's going to check on it, they're going to validate it, right? And there are places to be able to put in reasons why this happened, why did you need to do this, right? It gives us a way of being able to automate the ability to do it and yet audit the fact that we have done it. And to be able to enforce role-appropriate command validation, right? So I can't do everything at the command line, right? I can actually segregate out what people can and can't do, either based on their role or their function, or based on the systems that they're coming in from. And then being able to report on what has happened. To be able to report on who has access to what, and to certify that users have what they need to have in order to do their job. We want to be business enablers. We want to make sure people can do what they need to do, but we need to be able to do it securely. In the federal government, there's a requirement that every 6 months, managers certify that all the people that are their direct reports have access to what they need and nothing else, and they go through this certification process. And application owners are supposed to certify that everybody that has access to the application has a need to have that access. Oftentimes they don't know who all those users are, and they can delegate that to the manager. But we need to go through this certification process to remove those excessive rights, right? And to make sure that we understand that there are not orphaned accounts sitting out there that could be compromised. And to minimize role creep. And then being able to identify and record sessions, particularly for sensitive transactions or for system administration capabilities. So, what are the next steps and the best practices? Go through a process. Analyze the accounts, look at the entitlements, begin to do a cleanup, right? There is no sense instantiating bad accounts or bad practices into a privileged identity management solution. Go in and remove the orphaned accounts. Begin to look at how do I define some roles, and it's not an all or nothing solution. We can take this in small steps and begin to leverage some capabilities so that I can do some group management and to really begin to build a role model that makes sense for me, and then leverage that to make sure that I'm not granting excessive privileges. And automate the granting and removal of those accesses as people change, as they move, or they leave the organization altogether. And automate the super user or root account password management, or database account management, or even to be able to go in and find the script or the cron job that has the embedded password in it, and stub that out so that it does a call and grabs a new password every time that job runs. And then enforce the segregation of duties and provide a break glass capability. And then the next step is to go back and optimize that and refine the model as we go through it. So, we understand what the privileged user management entails, a little bit about what your agency's exposure may be, some of the recent breaches, and we begin to understand a little bit about some of the steps we need in order to be able to manage the process. So, are there questions? Does this resonate? Are you doing this already in your agency? A little bit? Yeah.
If you provide reports with, like, the different types of users and their permissions and privileges, what are some suggestions of having management, manager responsible for that to actually review it, say, okay, I'm not sure what's in this permission, following up on it, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's done timely and accurately.
Sure. And so the question is, how do you provide the reports and get management to take some action on it? There's a federal account that I work with. They have 70 full-time equivalents who have been tasked with sending out emails to managers, getting the responses back, compiling these spreadsheets about what all the users' accesses are, and then following up, trying to do the reports that flow up, and then when the 6-month cycle is up, starting all over again. It's just not effective, right? And it doesn't help anybody. They're producing lots of reports that nobody ever looks at. But what we need is the ability to automate some of it, to put reminders in as an automation part of the process, and to put a dashboard in so that the managers get reminded. We have a certification, what we call a certification campaign in progress, right? You've got 3 weeks left, you're only 10% of the way done, don't forget this is due. And when they go through and look at, so Bill has these 6 accounts that he has access to, or maybe these 12 accounts, right? He can approve some of them. He can say, I'll come back to some of these, and there may be some where he says, I don't have any idea whether Bill needs access to this system or not, right? So he can actually send out a message that says, I need more information. You're the team leader on this. Can you tell me whether Bill needs this access? So I can reassign that certification to somebody else, or I can simply ask for more information and then come back and complete it. And those dashboards can be segregated so that I see only the people that report to me, and as it rolls up the organization, that they get reports across their direct reports and across the people that report to those direct reports. But being able to see it in a dashboard, to be able to get some reminders, really helps us to be able to drive it and make use of it so that we're not just creating paper reports for the sake of creating paper reports.
Does a dashboard typically have explanations of the type of access they have, so if they're not sure what this means?
Sure, and some of it is that we need to be able to map names to something that makes sense. Right? So we have the ability to go in and customize some of that so that I'm not seeing, you know, Linux box AH179. What I'm seeing is, you know, finance database server, right? So that we can put labels on things that make some sense. And I understand, yes, this is part of what we ought to be doing, right? And I have the ability to push some of that down as well. Other questions, thoughts? Yep.
Can you talk a little bit more about, you talked about the human user being able to check out a password. Can you talk a little bit more about applications or other things that can check out a password and how that works?
Sure. So part of the privileged identity management and the privileged credential management is that we can set up a process where those passwords are not known or stored in the script, right? But rather it is a call, so it becomes a service call, and it gets, you know, it's what we call stubbed out, but basically we put a variable in the script in place of that password, the embedded credential that's there today, that says, when you get here, make this call to the password generation, right? Get the password for this, it'll use it, and when it's done, and we can set it so that a password only lasts for 6 hours or a day or whatever it is, right? And then the password would change, right? Because you won't check that password back in, but it essentially expires and the password gets changed. And the piece of that makes it hard is that we get jobs that run infrequently. So we have scripts that run every night. Those would be the things I would do first, obviously, because that's the biggest risk. But it's the things that run once a quarter or once a year where we have an embedded credential that sits unused for a long time and nobody's aware of that, right? Nobody's looking at that script. Those are the things that I want to be able to go out and capture and make that call be a dynamic credential request and have that be something that's only useful once. So it's essentially a one-time password. Other questions? Yep.
What's the largest and smallest organizations that you've helped in terms of numbers of accounts?
Wow.
Just ballpark.
Veterans Affairs is in the process of doing some of the privileged identity management and the password vaulting, as well as the fine-grained access control. And they're doing it for, they probably have a couple 100,000 system administrators overall across the entire United States and across the world. Some of the identity management, we're providing identity management and multi-factor authentication for IRS. They're doing it for 130 million users, so that you will be able, if you go out to get my transcript at IRS, it will go through a registration process, and it will actually provide you a credential that you can use, and eventually it will be a multi-factor authentication to do that, to be able to leverage that. For today, it's to get your tax transcript, but eventually it would be a credential that you could use at other federal sites as well. And then on the other end of it, I mean, we've done it for, 100 system administrators, or, at that point it becomes, how do we make it useful, and how do we show real return on your value quickly for you? Other questions? Yeah?
Are there tools out there to assist, like, any entity in scanning their, code to identify embedded passwords, whether it be mainframe or?
Right. So that's one of the key issues, is how do we find those embedded credentials? There are some scripts out there. There's some tools out there, and we have the ability to add that in. And it's one of the things that we'll be doing a better job of, is to help you be proactive in identifying where those are, so that you don't have to know the script to know that it has an embedded credential, but to actually be able to help find that. Yeah?
So there's a lot of the technology side here, in terms of best practice on the business process or operational process side, what sort of good steps you can take on the technology side for the operational process side?
Sure. So from the operational processing side, I think what we're really focused on is an understanding of, I thought one of the things Kevin Mandia said yesterday was, you can't patch people. I thought that was a really good quote. And one of the questions that came up was, is user training useful? Well, it is, and I think we need to continue to do that. We need to make people aware of it. The click or don't click is kind of, schmaltzy and whatnot, but it's those sorts of things. We need people to be aware of it, right? But we also need the ability to be able to help define what people are doing. And one of the biggest things that we need to do is to get a mapping into the business so that we understand the roles that people play. And this isn't roles from an IT side, but this is really a business role. What are these people doing? What do they need to have access to in order to do their job? And how do we make that work, and how do we provide them a way of being able to provide a consistent security enforcement so that they can do what they need to do as seamlessly as possible, and yet be able to do it in such a way that gives them good security around it, right? So understanding what groups of people ought to be, right? And being able to automate everything from the HR system down, how we define those roles and put people into those roles, and then be able to move towards some real role-based access control and provide that consistent enforcement across all of it. Other questions? I'll be around for the rest of the day. Thank you guys very much for coming out.